Good evening, everyone. I hope you guys are having a wonderful night today. So, it's been a while. We haven't done much grammar practice in quite a bit, but what we're going to be doing is going to pick up from where we left off. I guess technically it's been 3 weeks since we did a proper grammar lesson, but we did talk about the recap last week. So we're going to continue talking about the te form, and just as a brief reminder of what we can do with it so far, we've talked about how te form lets us ask for permission, or talks about things we can or can't do, how it represents a prohibited action. So if we're telling someone they can't play in a specific area, it's usually something that like adults will tell younger people or authority figures will tell to you. We also talked about if we ask te mo ii desu, like hon o yonde mo ii desu ka? May I read the book? You respond, hai, yonde mo ii desu. Yes, you may read the book. So converting our verbs into te form is something that we use in order to give permission. But the other thing that we talked about was connecting verbs, describing two things. In the past, we used the particle to describe two things, to attach two things together. Nihongo to eigo, Japanese and English. But we can't combine two verbs using that same particle, because again, they're different parts of speeches, so they have their own properties. Instead, we use te form to connect two verbs, similar to this. If I want to say that today I woke up at 6 a.m. and I studied, my two verbs, woke up and studied, 今日は6時に起きて勉強しました. So, okite, you could see we had that te form. Here we had borrow, karite. Note o karite, copy shimasu. So again, we use this te form in order to connect. That's our first verb there. We use that first verb in te form, and the following verb we just use as we would normally use a verb. That is what we talked about the last time we talked about grammar. Last time we talked about how to conjugate verbs properly. And today we're going to extend off of that. We're going to talk about some more uses on this. So, what it is that we're going to talk about, the new thing that we're going to talk about today, let's hide this for now, is the following suffix, the following sentence ender. And that is te, I, do. So what this is, in the past, as you know, a couple of lessons ago, we talked about the following verbs. We've talked about arimasu and imasu. And if you realize, arimasu and imasu, these are actually the root form, the dictionary form of these verbs are actually aru and iru. So what these verbs mean is essentially to be or to exist. When we use iru or aru, we know that aru refers to inanimate objects. And we know that iru refers to living things. So we know in the past we've made sentences similar like this. We've used arimasu and imasu to say things like koko wa neko ga imasu. Imasu is just the conjugated form of iru, the present positive, and this means there is a cat here? Very simple. We've talked about the imas and the arimas, how to use it to refer to things that are that are nearby, things that exist around us. There's a cat. Why did I write SIM? Let me erase this. There's a cat here. So we have a sentence like that. Now, we can also attach imas and I guess technically arimas, but typically we do this with imas because verbs are attached to, or because it's attached to verbs that are performed by people, living things. So if we attach imas to a te form verb, we'll actually get something that refers to the following. Let me make a new page for this. If we attach iru to another verb, it represents one of the following. It can represent either an action in progress, or it could represent a past event. So, de arimasu, at a super proper way of speaking, is that something that a casual? So, de arimasu, yeah, it's pretty formal. And a lot of what we're learning so far is basically like proper writing. Actually, next lesson is the lesson that we get to where we actually start talking about casual conversation and short form grammar. That's a good point to bring up. A lot of what we've been learning so far, we talk about like using des, we talk about using arimasu, imasu, shimasu, like the verb endings that we've been talking about so far, yeah, they're pretty much like formal, like proper writing. And actually, it's next lesson where we're going to talk about how to shorten things so that we sound more human. And this also talks about a past event connected to the present. And there's certain kinds of verbs where we can tell where this context happens based on the verbs used. We can determine which of these it pertains to. So, the book that I used actually broke this down into 3 groups, but the first group was fairly redundant, so I'm not going to mention that. It's the second and third groups that were important. The main group is verbs that take time to complete. So verbs, actions that take time to complete, things like, say, I'm eating, I'm reading, I'm studying, these are things that you do them over a course of time. They're not instant. It's not like say you get married. I'm married right now. That is something instant. You go from not being married to being married. When you're eating over a period of time. Or think about it like a verb, like if I say, I know something, right? You either know something or you don't know something. If you're in the process of beginning to understand or to know something, that's learning. But when you know something, it goes from not being learned to being learned. So those are examples of the opposite of this. Verbs that take time to complete, for example, though, we think about things like taberu, to eat, . Right, like a state of being. Actually, a state of being, like to be, is, am, are. That's what actually the first group was, but we already talked about the sentence structure for that kind of, for those kinds of sentences with the arimas and imas. So a state of being is like the third group, but we don't. The reason why I'm not going to cover that is because those are the main verbs that we really use in that case, that imas and arimas. I thought it would be a little redundant, so I haven't mentioned it, but that is correct. A state of being is like a sort of third topic here that we talk about. And we have just some examples of characters that represent things that you do over time. So taberu and yomu. Yomu, which is to read. So these actions take time to complete. And depending on how we write the sentence out, it can mean different things. For example, if I write the following sentence, Tanaka-san wa Nihon go. Let me just write this out. Nihongo o benkyou shimasu. So if I write this sentence out here, this is a sentence structure. This is a sentence structure that we've currently been practicing so far. Benkyou shimasu. So a lot of the sentences that I've gone over these past few lessons have been in this sort of format. Benkyou shimasu. And what this translates to is Tanaka studies Japanese. Because we have Tanaka-san wa Nihongo, Japanese, o benkyou shimasu. And benkyou shimasu. So actually, let me pull out the pointer here. So we know that Tanaka-san, that's this first part here. Nihongo, that's Japanese. And studies benkyou shimasu, studies Japanese. That's the sentence structure that we've been using so far. But now, when I modify the verb at the end, when I write it as the following, it'll change the properties, it'll change the idea behind the sentence. So let me just copy and paste most of the sentence. So we're going to copy up to here. And so now, if instead of that, if the ending is written as the following, if we then write the following as Tanaka-san wa Nihongo o benkyou shite imasu. Shite imasu. Because again, even though I referred to this section here as referring to it as te iru, the conjugated form of iru is imasu. So, Tanaka-san wa Nihongo o benkyou shite imasu. This is different. This means Tanaka is studying Japanese. So the difference here, the difference of ending our verb as benkyou shimasu versus benkyou shiteimasu, that difference is that shiteimasu means that they are currently in the process of doing so, that presently they are studying Japanese, versus this being a general thing that they do, this being something that is happening. This doesn't refer to the present moment, this just refers to that they are someone who studies Japanese, well, this means that at the present moment, that they are studying Japanese. So that's the difference there. That is what teiru represents. That it is an action that is happening. This can also be used to explain an occupation, a job. So if I were to write, can also be used to represent an occupation. An occupation or something that you do. So if I say, 僕は日本語を教え So this is actually the kanji for teaching. 教えています. A sentence like this represents I teach Japanese. However, because we also said that this can represent an action in progress, you have to make sure that you have the proper context here. It could represent that you are someone who teaches Japanese, or I am currently, as in you're in the classroom teaching a lesson, currently teaching Japanese. So if someone came into my stream and asked me what I was doing, I could respond saying, 僕は日本語を教えています. I am teaching Japanese right now. I could say off stream that on Thursdays, I teach Japanese by saying the same sentence, because it depends on the context in which we are doing this. The other kind of verb that we're going to talk about here is describing changes from there's no E in from one state to another. It also can be used to describe the result of a change. So what it is, right? We use a verb such as I say the following. If someone passes away, 死ぬ to die, that's an instantaneous thing. You're either alive or you're not alive. Or if you know something, like I said earlier, this is to know. So these aren't things that happen over time. It's binary. It's one or the other. It happens or it doesn't happen. So if I say something like Yamashita sensei Yamashita sensei wa haha and this is the kanji for mother 母を知っています。So what this means, right? What this means. This is Yamashita sensei. Or I guess in English we wouldn't say sensei. Professor. Scandalous, isn't it? Isn't it? Professor Yamashita knows my mother. So he knows. 知っています。Let me see. So that's really what it is, right? It represents knowing something. If I said 知っていません, then that would mean that he doesn't know my mother. That's really the main concept to take with these verbs. That it represents that state of being, that you are in the process of doing something, that it is something that you are, that you know, that you are, that you have, that you're doing. It represents actions in progress or past events connected to the present. Because if he had met your mother before, that means that he knows your mother. He wouldn't know it if he didn't meet her in the past. So that is what attaching that iru, that imasu, represents. However, that's with verbs. This is essentially attaching a verb to iru in order to get the understanding that an action is happening at that current moment. And it's just another use for that te form. Now, the next thing, and it's going to sound a lot scarier than it seems, but there's also te form to connect adjectives. So what this is... Hey Spuds, good evening, and good evening to you too, Reina. We're just going over some more te form properties here, some rules here. So in order to connect multiple adjectives, we have to talk about the te form. Gokigenyo. We have to talk about... Wait, is my chat box not up? Did I invisible that? I just realized, yeah, that's invisible. There we go. So, te form to connect adjectives. To connect to adjectives, we must use their te forms. Now, this isn't as scary as it sounds. It's definitely nowhere near as bad as the te form for the verbs. And there's very simple rules for this. So if I have an e adjective, and for an example, we'll use the example that we used last week. We'll use samui. And I won't write it backwards this time. So samui, which again, as you remember, means cold. Samui. The te form of this is samu. Samukute. Very simple. The e turns into kute. And just like with the adjectives before, the irregular version of e adjectives, which is that e, just like how I for that past present turned into, like how I this turns into yokatta this. I turns into yokute. Very simple. And same with like words like kakkoi. Kakkoi would be kakkoyokute if we were to convert that into te form. And again, just like with the verbs, these are just rules. Once we see them in sentences, you'll see how they flow properly. The na adjectives are also fairly simple. And we're going to use the same example that we used just for consistency's sake. The example of na adjectives that we used back then was genki, or energetic. Genki. Genki, and then you would add that na. When we put this into te form, when we want to connect them, we end up doing genki. Genki de. That's it. Nothing complicated, it's just genki de. And then if you have a noun, you do a noun this. Because we also know that sometimes we just end sentences with this. The proper conjugation for this is, let's say, Nihonjin, which is a Japanese person. Nihonjin desu simply turns into Nihon Jin de. And that's it. Those are all the rules we need to know. That's it for adjectives. It doesn't get any more complicated than that. I turns into kute, na turns into de. And so we're going to use some examples with this. Just to see it in action, just to make sure that we understand the rules here. So if I wanted to say the following sentence. The hotel was clean and we were happy. It's alright, Seer. Good to see you here. Still, at least in class. It's nice to see you. We're just talking about some more te form stuff. This time we're applying it to adjectives. Just talking about how to properly connect multiple modifiers to a single sentence. So if I say this sentence here, the hotel was clean and we were happy. Because you're always nice. You're always happy to see a clean hotel room, that the room service was good and they didn't mess up anything. All the sheets are in place. Missing class, it's alright. I always appreciate at least the effort. Sometimes, life gets in the way. Sometimes you just miss the alarm. Let's say the Japanese word for hotel is hoteru. Very simple. Hoteru wa. The word for clean or pretty is kirei. And kirei is a na adjective, so it'd be hoteru wa kirei de. That's what we use to connect. Kirei de yokatta desu. Very simple. Hoteru wa kirei de yokatta desu. The hotel was clean. Pretty. And then yokatta is good or happy. As closer to this translates to we were happy because, yokatta is good, was good. And that's why it's saying we were happy. Good. Past tense. Hotel was clean. Good. So there's no and here. There's no actual word here. Kirei de. This is the closest thing that we can relate to it. That putting this adjective in that te form, that's our and. That's what serves that purpose. Let's say I want to say the store, or actually the food. The food at that store is cheap and delicious. So what we have here, so that we use ano, and then this kanji we're a little familiar with. We've used it a couple times. Ano mise, and food at that store. If we're saying the food at that store, we're going to connect ano mise with no. Ano mise no. And for representing food, it's ta. Tabemono. Ano mise no tabemono. Stores food. Ano mise no tabemono wa and we get yasu. Yasukute oishii desu. So, 店の食べ物は安くて美味しいです。安くて, like we said before. Wrong layer. Like we said before, the e adjective, samui, turns into samukute. Yasui is also an e verb, so yasui turns into yasukute. Yasukute oishii desu. Yasukute, so it's cheap. Oishii is delicious. And that's just another example. So the first verb, or the first adjective that we use is always in that te form. The second one is in the regular form. However, we would end a sentence with that. So very similar to connecting two verbs in a sentence, like what we talked about a couple weeks ago. I believe it's this slide here. Let me see. Yeah, this slide. Okite benkyou shimashita. Is there an order to adjectives like in English, or could I say tabemono wa oishikute? Yeah, no, there's no order. You could definitely reverse it. Yeah, you could reverse it. So if you wanted to say ano mise no tabemono wa oishikute, and then yasui desu, that would work too. That would be also correct. So you could say that it was delicious and cheap, or you could say it was cheap and delicious. Either way would work. That's a good question, though. That's the main thing with adjectives, right? So just like with verbs, we have their te form. The first one is always put in te form. The second one is written to indicate whatever tense that we're talking in. And this next one isn't necessarily te form, but it's also another important distinction to make, another important sentence structure to go over right now. And what that is verb stem plus ni i u. So this is these sentences that we're going to talk about now. What this is going to be. We're not going to focus on te form for this one, so it's going to be a little different. But these sentences here that we're going to go over is going to represent going to a specific location with a specific purpose in mind. So these are still going to involve two verbs. One of these verbs being a motion verb like iku or kiru or kairu. But the first verb is going to be a little different. And we're going to need to think back a while back to what we talked about as the stem form of a verb. But the rule for that's not bad either. So, if a person moves to another location to do something, we can explain it with the following structure. And this structure will work for pretty much any kind of sentence that involves this kind of thought pattern. So that the structure is going to be destination. And then we talked about this last week, but the particle here between ni and e, both of these represent movement, so either of them is usable, though some cases you might want to use e because it represents more of a purpose within your movement, but both of these are valid particles to use here. Purpose, ni, and then we can end the sentence with one of the following. Iku, kuru, kuru, or kairu. So this is to go, to come, to return. That's iku, kuru, kairu. Ooh, I didn't actually write the ru for this one, so let me just pull this over to the side a little bit, just to make sure we have it, we don't keep it inconsistent. Kairu. So, what's different about this sentence structure here is that the verb that is put in purpose, the verb here, verb must be in stem form. And what stem form is, just as a reminder, it's the same thing as the present positive. Without the must. So, like, for example, for the verb to read, yomimasu, on o yomimasu would be I'm reading, or I read, but the stem form of that would just be hon o yomi. So I guess we wouldn't use it in that particular sentence structure, but for example, yomi yomimasu. This turns into just yomi, you know? We just drop the mas. And that's the rule. Yomi. Or even if we had something like the other verb that we used here today, benkyou shimasu. Like a verb that ends with suru. Benkyou shimasu, we simply would just drop that mas, benkyoshi. And in order to see how this applies to the actual sentence structure, I actually want to do this so I can have the whole thing on one slide. I hope that's still a little readable. It looks readable on my preview, so it should be readable for you guys if you're at least on full screen. So if I write the following sentence out. Actually, let me make this a little smaller because I want to give myself enough space. There we go. This should be enough space now. Let's say, if I want to use a sentence, I went to school to study. Very simple sentence. We can see that this fits into the idea of the sentence structure. We have a destination. I went to school. The purpose was to study. The way we would use this sentence structure here, the way we would apply our goal here, our purpose, the movement, would be the following. School is gakko. That's our destination. Gakko. Gakko ni benkyou shi. We just write out ben. And we write out kyo. Shi. And note that I'm not writing out benkyou shimasu because we're just writing out that stem form. We're dropping the mas. That happens for this purpose here. Gakko ni benkyou shi ni I. And because this is what we're doing, because I went to school, I ma shita. So that first verb, our purpose verb, what we're doing, the action that we're taking to reach our goal, is just in that stem form. We drop the mas there. Gakko ni benkyou shi ni ikimashita. Gakko is school. Benkyou shi, that represents to study. Ikimashita means you traveled. Oh, thank you. So, the way it works, again, we have our destination, gakko ni. We use the ni as a particle there. I forgot this grammar, yeah. It seems like a really specific case, but I think it's important for chaining together, because this case here, it's specifically for chaining together verbs with movement. Movement for a specific purpose. Instead of just saying that you're going to school, you're saying why you're going to school. Benkyou shi ni ikimashita. And I think what would have tripped me up the most, like going back to this, is that stem form here. It's so like, this is the first time we're really using stem form for a grammatical use. Gakko ni benkyou shi ni ikimashita. Ikimashita means went to. We have a purpose, we have a destination, and that is how we lay it all out. And so the next thing I want to talk about, let me pull up my book here. I wasn't sure how fast or slow I would go through this, so I left out one section from this lesson that I do want to talk about since we have quite a bit of time. And this one here is for conversational usage. This is going to be, let me just go back a little bit here in my textbook. This one here. What we're going to talk about here, I think it's kind of weird that they have this section just thrown in the middle of this chapter. I don't really see how it's exactly related, but we could say the following, or we're going to talk about the following here. Describing people's actually, I guess that would be people's apostrophe. Or, you know what? We'll write it like this. Describing someone's features. So if we're talking about someone's features, you know, their hair, their body parts are long, you know, like they got a big head, they got big eyes, they got big feet, you know? We're going to talk about how to describe that. So you could say something like the following. You could make the following sentence. Let's say, Naka san no me wa say o I this. So if I have the sentence written out like this, Tanaka-san no me wa ookii desu. What this quite literally means is Tanaka eyes are big. So he has big eyes. This is very literal. But in conversational Japanese, or like in the Japanese language, what would be more natural to say would be a sentence like this. We'll just mark this as X. Then we're going to say, we want to talk about his eyes. Tanaka san wa me ga ookii desu. What this means still means that Tanaka's eyes are big, but a more literal translation based on this particle usage here would be along the lines of, as for Tanaka, he has big eyes. So it comes off more naturally in the language there. I'm not sure why exactly it is that that particle usage is more correct. Tanaka-san wa me ga ookii. Seems like, because like we know that wa is like it's a state of, it's the particle that more or less represents like being something in particle form. Tanaka-san is big-eyed, I guess, is sort of what it's going for here. And ga usually is another thing that represents being. So it's interesting to see how the particle usage gets used there, because typically for us as English speakers, learning the language here, Tanaka-san no me usually makes more sense to represent a person, like something of a person. But it seems that with body parts that they want to go for Tanaka-san wa me, which, again, I'm not a professional at Japanese, so I really just have to trust what the book tells me here. So if you were to talk about someone's features, someone's body parts, you would be talking about it in this format here. So physical attributes, things like hair as well, it would be written in this form. It would be wa, and then the body part, ga, and then the descriptors. So a typical list, like a list of some body parts here, like they wrote this out. They have, actually I could write it on the same layer. Let me also resize this. And let's see, transform controls for this layer. I think it'd be nice to have this also all on one page. Maybe maybe it is too direct, like, wa talks about, like... It talks about their being, essentially. While no might be like... You know, like the eyes that he holds. Like, he stole some eyes from a body and they're his eyes now. Maybe that's why? Like, the possession is too direct? That... I could see why that would be the case, maybe. That's a pretty interesting, like, possible explanation for it. But the typical... A typical safe sentence structure that we could use here would be X-san wa. And we could talk about different kinds of body parts. You know, we could say ne. There's eyes. I'm gonna write the I'll give a little bit of a mini lesson here, a little bit of a kanji refresher. Ne for eye. We could talk about ears. We could say ears or mimi. Ear. This is me. You could say foot. Feet are all the rage, it seems, nowadays with the VTubers. With that whole feet up on the desk thing. This is ashi. That's the worst A I've ever written in my life. Nowadays it seems like everyone wants feet. So I guess it's how everyone gets away with having like a bust-up model, and then, you know, they get to just have their feet up on the desk. Doesn't have to be emotion-filled live TD. Ashi. What? So we could say X-san wa, and then any of these kinds of body parts. And this is just some examples of body parts. Oh, I also missed this one. Very common body part to talk about. Te. And it's just te. X-san wa te ga. And some other adjectives here. We haven't talked too much about them, so this seems like a pretty simple, innocuous kind of section to introduce some of these adjectives here. We could say things like I mentioned earlier, this is oki, which is oki, which is big. We could say chisai, chisai, small. We could say something like kawaii, which we don't have the kanji for that. Because we don't really use a kanji for this one. Kawaii. Everyone knows this one. Cute. And these are just some examples of modifiers here. And we would end it with this. And essentially what this means is person A has body part, which is blank. Let me actually resize this a little bit more, just so I can fit in the translation as well. So we could say person X has a body part which is adjective. Very straightforward, very simple. It's a little different from what we'd be used to in English, but the idea is the same. We give the body part, we use the descriptor for the adjective. The only real challenge here is that as like English speakers, we have typically kind of particles that we've learned that we'd probably be inclined to try to use to describe the body part. But again, we can't just one-to-one translate everything in English to Japanese, because that's just not how the language works. They have things that are different than how we would expect them to be, and that's fine. And the last thing, is there something else I want to talk about? I think that's pretty much it for now. I think that's a pretty good stopping point. This book also has, in this chapter, a lesson on counters, which, you know, I might as well mention this because I've talked about counters in the past, but I think it's a pretty good idea to talk about this because it's a pretty basic counter. It's something that comes up very frequently when you're talking about the amount of people. And it's always good to review our numbers here because, you know, numbers are important. Let's do this, just to make sure we get over a solid hour here. So, counting people. So to count people, numbers, don't worry, Sir, we're not going to go too big. We're only going to go up to 10 here. So the counter for people, like I mentioned before, pretty much everything that you can count has a specific symbol that we use to count them. The counter for people is simply the kanji for person, but it's pronounced as nin. However, one person and two people are exceptions. And you'll see that it's a pretty common term that you'll see for one person and two people. This is what the list looks like. If you have one person, is itori. One person is also sometimes used for alone. Itori. That's when, like, when people say hitori bochi, that means it's all alone, you know? Because hitori, being one person, means that you're the only person there, you're alone. Two people is futari. And in kanji is written as futari. Simply just the number 2 followed by the kanji for person. Three people. And this is where it starts to get standardized. Three people is sannin. If you think about it, if you've watched Naruto, when they talk about the 3 legendary ninja, the sannin, they probably use a different kanji, but that's how I remember 3 people, is that san, nin. It's literally 3 people. The 3 legendary ninja, the sannin, it's just 3 guys. Sannin. 4 people. Those 3 guys, you know, the strongest ninja in pretty much all existence. Yeah, I think it's nin from ninja, in the same way that they had, like, genin, chunin, jonin. So, those were all basically, like, the levels of, like, ninja. And I guess those 3 were so powerful that they called them the 3 ninja. You know, the 3 that no one else can match up to. 4 people would be yonin. Actually, this one's interesting, because this is just yonin. As opposed to, we know that the number 4 is yon, but it looks like here, in the case for number 4, yonin, the N sort of is carried into the nin, yonin. And that's 4인. 5 people. The pattern continues, but just to get used to seeing how these counters work, this is important too, just knowing how it'll continue counting up. This is going to be 5인. Every counter tends to have its own exceptions and its own, like, sort of like numbers that'll break apart from the norm, like how here it's not 4인, but 4인. But typically, this is how counting upwards goes for any counter. Right, for ages and hours, it's so complicated, isn't it? Yeah, hours. It's like ichiji, niji, sanji, yonji, goji, rokuji, and so on. And it's not even just ages and counters, or ages and hours. For people, and they have, like, for paper, sheets of paper, for cylindrical objects. That's so specific. Cylindrical objects they have a specific counter for, amongst other things. It's just... it's definitely... I know they have it for, like, floors as well. 5인. And we'll just breeze through the rest of this. 6 people. That's 6인. This is 6인. 7 people. This one actually kind of is a little different as well. We could do 7인 or 8인. Both of them work. For consistency's sake, for simplicity's sake, I'm just gonna leave it as 8인 because, you know, that's what we use to count 7 for a lot of other counters, like oh wait, no, we use shichiji for time. I'll stay consistent with that. Shichi nin? Right? Isn't it a nightmare? Have to know all these different counters. That's why I just want to throw a simple one at you guys first. This is the first time we've really done counters for anything. And I think counting people is fairly straightforward. 7 people. 8 people. That is hachi. Oh, I haven't been writing these down, the translations. Let me make some space here. I was wondering why I started not going as far down. And then, just want to make sure I have the space here because I think something like this is a pretty good visual for reading out characters. So this is going to be san nin. It's interesting how san has the end sound followed by the nin, but 4 doesn't. Yonin. And then gonin. Then let's just move these down, make sure that I give myself that room. Let's go down here. And let's just give ourselves a little bit more room here. And this is going to be rokunin. This is going to be shichinin. This is going to be hachinin. And hachi is hachinin. Hachinin. 9 people. Is going to be Kyunin. That's Kyunin. Or number 9 is written as Kyunin. And then 10 people. I like the number 10 because it's very simple looking. 10 people is 10人. I'm running out of space here. 10人. Or 10人. Because 10 looks like a plus sign. This is 10人. And that is how we count to 10 people. Safe. So, 1人、2人、3人、4人、5人、6人、7人、8人、9人、10人. One person, two people, 3 people, 4 people, 5 people, 6 people, 7 people, 8 people, 9 people, 10 people. That is how to efficiently use the entire blackboard, isn't it? I like this. This is some good space usage here. We went a little bit onto the wood of the blackboard, but that's okay. That's it. We talked about how to attach verbs together. We talked about... Let's recap now. So we started the lesson talking about teiru, and how in the past we talked about... Let me get my pointer right here, actually. We talked about how arimasu and imasu... We talked about sentences here that represent living objects sort of existing, you know? Koko wa neko ga imasu. There is a cat here. Imasu represents existence. And so using that existence, iru, when used just to describe objects, itself is just representing that state of being. But if we attach that imasu, that iru, to another verb, it can then represent that the action is being done in progress, or that a past event is being connected to the present, that something that happened in the past is being related to information now. And based on which verbs we use, we can determine that. The first case we talked about was verbs that take time to complete, you know? Taberu is to eat, yomu is to read. When we're eating, when we're reading, these are actions that take time to complete. We don't immediately, we don't walk up to the food, press the A button, and then go on our day and the food's been eaten. We actually have to sit down and eat it. Same with reading. As much as I'd love for reading to be an activity where I could walk up to a book, press the A button, and then I have all the knowledge, it unfortunately is not the case. So when we talk about verbs that take time to complete, we could say, Tanaka-san wa Nihongo o benkyou shimasu. This is the sentence structure that we've learned already. And it just means that we study Japanese, that Tanaka studies Japanese. But if I use imasu, if I attach imasu here, instead of ending with benkyou shimasu, if we do benkyou shite imasu, it changes it. This sentence means that studying Japanese is a thing that Tanaka does. It's not indicating that it's happening right now, that it's not indicating that it's a thing that he's currently doing, but, you know, like say Tanaka had Japanese as a class, you know? That Tanaka was in a Japanese class, but maybe today he's not there. That's what this would represent. Maybe Tanaka has a Japanese test coming up and he went to his dorm to study. Someone would ask what Tanaka's doing. You would say, Tanaka-san wa Nihongo o benkyou shite imasu. That right now, at this moment, Tanaka is studying Japanese. That's the difference between these two sentences. And then we talked about how this can also be used to represent an occupation. If I said, Boku wa Nihongo o oshiete imasu, it represents that I teach Japanese, or, depending on the context of where I'm saying this, that I am currently teaching Japanese. If I said it right now, well, it would definitely obviously mean I am currently teaching Japanese. But, you know, if it wasn't Thursday, that's the difference between saying at a hotel, my pillow is dirty, and I dirtied my pillow. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That the pillow was dirty, or you dirtied the pillow, essentially. Because the second one is an action that you had taken over time just now, but the first one, the former, is the state of the pillow as you had arrived at your hotel. That's a good one to bring up. And the other one here describing changes from one state to another, or the result of a change. You know, how the past affects the present. And the case we used here was, Yamashita sensei wa haha o shitte imasu. Professor Yamashita knows my mother. You know, because to know someone, it'd have to have been something that had happened in the past that would have resulted in him knowing first, before you could say that he knows your mother. This one was a little bit complicated, though, a little bit complicated to find, like, a good English comparison between shitteimasu and shirimasu. But knowing is just one example of it. If I read out the example in my textbook, actually, the example that they used was... They use an example like, Yamashita sensei wa kekkon shiteimasu, where kekkon shiteimasu means is married, as opposed to, like, you don't, getting married isn't something that happens, like, over time. You get married. So it wouldn't be right to say something along the lines of, Yamashita sensei wa kekkon shirimasu. Because, you know, if I'm saying kekkon shirimasu, that means that, like, is getting married. I guess you could say that. If you were to say that, that would represent that he's at his wedding day. But any other time that you say that, it doesn't make sense. So kekkon shirimasu would represent is getting married, while kekkon shiteimasu means that he is married. For this case here, I guess the difference would be if I were to say Yamashita sensei wa haha o shirimasu, that would mean Professor Yamashita is getting to know my mother, as opposed to shitteimasu as Yamashita knows my mother. That's the difference there. That's between, like, a past experience and what is happening in the present. Teimasu means that presently he knows that. He knows her. So there was that. Then there was te form to connect adjectives. And that was just, if we want to connect two adjectives, we need to use their te form. We convert them. Samui turns into samukute, ii turns into yokute, genki na turns to genki de, and nihonjin desu turns into nihonjin de. Very simple rules compared to the entire, like, song that was the verb te forms. And we just did some examples. Like, hoteru wa kirei de yokatta desu. The hotel was clean and we were happy. Or, mise no tabemono wa yasukute oishii desu. And someone had asked before, like, what happens if we swap the order of the adjectives? If I say, mise no tabemono wa oishite, or oishikute yasui desu. Right, having to memorize that to speak correctly. Well, the good things here is that next lesson, actually, we're going to be talking about what we call short form. So this seems like a lot right now. But next week's lesson is actually going to be how we can shorten all this, how we can talk more casually, so that we don't have to be so formal, that this writing here is proper writing, but it's important for us to know how to write properly first, before we can actually get to that conversational, that short form sort of writing. So that's the big thing. And then the next page, we talked about the verb stem here, how we talk about moving to a destination with a purpose, with the example, Gakkou ni benkyou shi ni ikimashita, that the purpose verb, the verb that we use here, just has to be shortened to its stem form. And then we have our motion verb, which has that, which gives us our tense there. There was that part, and then we just talked about some things about body parts and counting people. So that was the lesson. It's quite a bit. I think what this one was, there were some main topics here and then a couple of extra things that, you know, I guess they had to put it somewhere, so they put it in this chapter. But that's pretty much it for today. So I hope you guys all learned something. I hope it made sense, especially. I hope if you're familiar with the language that it helped you recall some things. If you're not, if this was all new to you, I hope it made sense. That's good. That's good. That's good. And so next week, like I said, we're going to be doing a lesson on short form. We're going to be doing a lesson on how to talk more formally, how to talk, or not, how to talk less formally, I should say. And it's actually, we're going to have a special guest on stream. And that guest is the VTuber known as Satsuma Bimo. She has taught in Japan before. She's taught in Japan for a long time. And I thought that it would be a good idea to do a lesson on conversational Japanese with her because, you know, as someone who had been in Japan, she could help me get practice with this conversational speaking after I teach the lesson on it. And she'll also be there to make sure that as I'm teaching the lesson that I don't say anything dumb or that the things that I say are actually factually correct. So that's what we're going to be looking forward to next week. I hope you guys have a wonderful night. And I guess we could look for someone to raid. We're a small group, but, you know, every little bit, everyone counts, everyone matters, right? Let's go see who we can go and talk to. Let's see. And of course, I'm glad you liked the lesson. Let's go raid Valraven. Raid Valraven. She's playing some Mustache right now. And as always, thanks for coming to class, and we're all dismissed.